Good evening and welcome to Making Life Brighter Radio, and I'm your host, Winifred Adams, and we have returned special guest, retired Army Sergeant, Mr. William Kotel, and he is poking the snake in Washington, and he's doing it well. So, boy, do we have a show for you today. And for those of you that have tuned in previously to all the Voice America episodes, you might want to go back and review the episodes that we did in 2019 about Benghazi, and you will learn so much more there about William and his involvement over in Centcom, and you'll learn more about why we covered that in Benghazi, and then also additionally what's happened since then and why it ties into this very interview today. So William?
Oh, hold on. Hello, this is William Kotel.
Hey, William, it's nice to have you back. Thank you for being back here on Making Life Brighter. And we appreciate all your insight and your knowledge. And since we did the Death for Dollars campaign back about the COVID and what Cuomo was doing in New York State, we've had a lot of rumbling about that. Since we talked about Benghazi, people have been tuning into that, and you can find those things on Voice America and on YouTube on Making Life Brighter. So today we have a very important deep dive, and William has some very important information that he wants to share because he has created a mandamus that's been held up in the court systems, but he is calling out what's happened in Afghanistan. He's calling out what's happening near South America, and he's calling out Biden. So William, without further ado, let's jump into Afghanistan. Let's talk about what it is you filed and why you filed it.
Sure, just let me back up 1 second. I want to just reiterate about Benghazi. The only reason I brought Benghazi back to the forefront was not only because I had firsthand knowledge of what went down, but also because it was a mechanism for the prior president, President Trump, to remove obstructionists from within the government of the executive branch. And that was a key factor for me because it was a simple case and it only involved so many individuals, not a great deal, and they weren't hard to go back on. Unfortunately, the prior president refused to want to deal with that issue. And at the same time, we kind of tried to give closure to some of the Gold Star families like Mr. Charles Woods. So that's just my backing up to the Benghazi piece. But to jump into Afghanistan, let me take you through the steps of what I went through. So during the initial phase of the Afghanistan drawdown in the end of August of 2021, I was shocked. I was out of my mind shocked. I could not believe what I was seeing. Now, to recall about what happened in the past before this was now Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, back then was Lieutenant General Lloyd Austin, running armed forces in Iraq back in 2011 and 12, and was ordered by President Obama to remove all troops from Iraq. Well, in his zeal to do this and pin his fourth star and take Central Command as his new command, he left over $8 billion worth of equipment. And anybody watched the news about Al-Qaeda then that turned to ISIS then, and how they started rolling around and conducting attacks with our equipment. That was exactly what happened back then. This is known as patterns of misconduct. Fast forward to the Afghanistan withdrawal, and this pattern of misconduct was to the 10th level. It was out of control. So there was a whole lot of problems initially with Afghanistan. I did Inspector General complaints to both Department of Defense and Department of State, and also to the executive branch, or the OIG, while this was going on the 26th and 27th of August. Department of Defense got back with me and told me that this administration was doing nothing wrong. It infuriated me because everybody knows that if you even draw one piece of equipment from the military and you lose it or break it or damage it, the soldiers are liable and they have to pay for it. This was an inordinate amount of equipment. Not only was it being left behind, but it was being left to the Taliban, which is a known terrorist group. And P.S., by the way, there was elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS also in there on the ground that this was also being given to. And as soon as we left, the Taliban was kind enough to sell a lot of this equipment that they thought was very important equipment to both China and Russia and Iran. And this went on, and I was just appalled. I mean, you're talking Blue Force trackers, you're talking classified material stuff, you're talking sensitive items, and you're talking about the BAT system, the biometric data system that everyone uses in state and Department of Defense to ID personnel that are both, U.S. and foreign nationals. And they left this stuff there. More importantly, they left people, U.S. citizens there, to be used as hostages. This was outrageous. To top it all off, we used the wrong airfield. But then the exact number 2, which is now number 1, Al-Qaeda target, high value target, which is kill capture to this day, was sitting outside one of the gates with HVT number 9. And they sat there the day prior to the bombings, and no one acted on it. And then when the bombing took place and we lost 13 service members for no reason whatsoever, they weren't given any updated information or trying to do anything to mitigate or stop those attacks that they knew were coming. We lost 13 soldiers for nothing, and no one actioned those targets. So this turned into a fiasco right quick.
Yeah.
So anyways, post this fiasco, to put it mildly, and to try to get some clarity on this, I got very incensed. I got very angry. So what I did is I took my time to put together what's called a writ of mandamus. In other words, it's a massive legal document that I wrote up myself. I'm not a lawyer. I did it in a pro se, which means you're not a lawyer, and it was for the Supreme Court. The mandamus, I broke it down into 3 sets of laws. I broke it down first into constitutional law, second into federal law, and third into Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is military law. I broke it down in the aspects of pieces of equipment, their relevance, what U.S. codes they fall under. I broke down the intelligence failure and the 15-6 investigation that needs to be conducted to find out why that even happened and why everyone's patting themselves on the back for airlifting 124,000 Afghanis out of Afghanistan. We didn't even know more than 20,000 of them.
Exactly.
We had no clue who they are.
Right.
We
are engaging in allowing our own assets to go lost or stolen or used against us. In fact, now we get to house, pay for, and allow people in. And by the way, if I remember correctly, I think when those people got here, I thought I heard that they were actually giving them ivermectin. I think that's interesting as well, but go on.
That is interesting. Well, I mean, there's groups of them down by MacDill. I mean, they're being greeted very warmly and welcomed. But if you contrast that to the crisis in Ukraine right now, we're not giving them refugee status or, trying to get refugees out of the Ukraine or Poland area that have been evacuated. But we definitely got a bunch out of Afghanistan. Many we don't know who they are, and we're paying a pretty penny for them. But to get back to the mandamus, I also did this after conducting not one but 2 Inspector General's complaints with both agencies, Department of State and Department of Defense. And I used those as part of my tools in there. I also put into it the laws that allow the Inspector Generals the authority to include over the President of the United States to take actions. Now, I submitted my initial mandamus in October of last year, 2021. Prior to doing that, I had sent copies of that to senators and congressmen. Several were on the Armed Forces Committee and several were not. And it was Congresswoman Marjorie Greene out of Georgia that actually sponsored an article of impeachment. And it's listed as HR or House Resolution 598. And I was stunned. I was happy about it, but that's, again, another back burner issue since then. My initial mandamus was submitted, and the clerks of the court reviewed it and said it was a good document, and they forwarded it to review. Well, the review section had taken it, and they had shut it off and kicked it back, but didn't send me a letter for 2 months. I found that to be very upsetting. The letter did declare or show what my deficiencies were which there should have been none, but there were deficiencies according to them. So I just took my time and I corrected those deficiencies. I resubmitted with the old mandamus, a new mandamus after correcting these deficiencies as of 22 January this year, 2022. As
So
of 26 January. Go ahead.
excuse me, William, I don't mean to interrupt you, but for people that would like to see this and download it, it'll be on the website, makinglifebrighter.com. Makinglifebrighter.com. You will find this mandamus. When this show is out, you will be able to go there and look at that and see it for yourself. So it's living there. Go ahead, William.
Thank you for that. That definitely would help. A lot of people could read it, and it may sound like a lot of legal jargon, but actually, if you've ever been in the military or federal government, it's very easy to read. And anyways, on the 22nd, I submitted it in January of 2022. On 26 January 2022, it was denied again, and I had to call the Supreme Court 3 days in a row to get anyone to answer the phone. And I finally got a hold of the chief of the clerks. And I was told that a woman out of the review section is the same woman that denied it last time. In discussion with her on the phone, she stated to me that I had to go through a different court first. And then when I tried to clarify and ask her, you're saying I have to file this in another court before I go to the Supreme Court? She says, no, that's not what I said. I said, okay, so what are you saying? What are my deficiencies this time? She goes, you'll have to get the letter and see for yourself. And as of March 7th, which is today's date, I still have no letter showing me the declining issues. So what I've done is I've taken the mandamus, I've sent it to Senator Rick Scott from Florida's office in D.C., where he has a legal review panel or legal review personnel, and they're going to go over this document to find out why the Supreme Court has denied it. And the reason this is scary is because anybody that submitted a Supreme Court case, especially those that are not lawyers, but wanted their voices heard, their court documents may not ever get filed, especially if they have some merit against this administration. I hate to say this, but somebody in that review office is playing politics, and that's not the place to do it. This is totally illegal. I want to call your attention to the rule of Miranda. Miranda is where law enforcement has to read you your rights, saying your right to remain silent, you have the right, to an attorney and all that. That came out of an index card written in pencil by an inmate in the 1960s and is on display at the Supreme Court for everyone to see. This is where Miranda came from, an index card handwritten in pencil. And I've done my document to T exactly the way they've stated it. I followed their instructions, and they still found a way to block it.
Well, William, could you not go back and call out the clerk specifically in another writ, actually, because the clerk is not doing their duty. And therefore, if someone wanted to argue that the courts were technically closed at this point and say, well, that's not, we're not filing things or something like that. But the clerk's sitting there and the clerk's taking calls and clerk is processing something. So therefore, this should also be equally processed properly. And perhaps you can call the clerk out directly in another writing, because you're asking the court to recognize it, but the clerk is the court essentially, so they aren't recognizing it. Why do you think that is?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Let me answer you that. I have a three-part answer. First off, the clerks at the Supreme Court are good people. They do a good job. This person, she works in the review section, which is above the clerks, but still underneath the chief clerk. And that's the office that your documents go from the clerk. The clerk verifies that it is a viable legal document or a viable document and doesn't have any procedural problems. So the review office is where it goes to next. That office has the sole responsibility of reviewing documents and ensuring that they're not allowed to be seen. Now, it's one thing if the court says, well, we've seen the document, we're not going to hear the case. They have a legal right to do that, which is fine. But that meant it would have had to have been docketed. In my case, it never got docketed because It never made it through review. Even with the clerk saying you're good to go, you followed the letter of correction to a T, you're good to go. That's why I did the second thing, which was submitted to Senator Rick Scott's office. And the reason I can't submit another document to the Supreme Court about the clerk is federal law says I have to take her to court individually
Right.
to a lesser or a lower federal court.
That's what
To
I
do
mean.
that would cost me thousands of dollars I don't have and a bunch of transportation time.
Okay,
And it would take
Patriots,
months.
you're hearing the call, Patriots. He needs to file on the clerk. Go ahead, William.
But even if I filed, like I said, just to get her recognized as being the stopping point, what'll happen is it'll take months and months and months. Now, if you look at the situation of Afghanistan, right,
Mhm.
and you look at the my mandamus, if it had been heard in a timely fashion like it was supposed to be, it's supposed to be heard very quickly because it's a pro se emergency writ of mandamus, right? Then maybe, just maybe, Putin wouldn't be in Ukraine right now killing civilians. You got to think about that. The weakness shown with Afghanistan would have been, I mean, lessened had anybody followed through and the courts ruled in my favor, saying, yes, the Biden administration is not treasonous, but what they're doing is they have to go back and go get our equipment and our personnel. That's all I asked for in my writ. I want them to go back and to get our people out and to get our equipment out. Whether it requires another military action or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is we lost everything in there. No excuse.
William,
It's no excuse.
isn't there a fellow that's a retired Navy officer that's in the Congress and he's helping get people out of war zones and things? Why couldn't he go and help besides?
Okay, so I talked to a congressman named Congressman Waltz, and Waltz was ex-Army Special Forces, and he's currently in the Florida National Guard, and he sits on the Congressional Armed Services Committee. He has two military liaisons that work for him that are retired military. One's a retired Navy captain. I'd sent information to them about this and asked them to take some kind of action. But instead, the congressman has been on the news every other day with Fox News talking about how he's backdooring onesie and twosie people out of Afghanistan. What that equates to is hiring a merc group and paying off different people and border guards to get these individuals out through backdoor methods. But you sit on the Armed Services Committee. Why can't you sponsor a bill? So I actually wrote a bill for his office to sponsor the Armed Services Committee to go back and get our equipment and our people. And that was just tossed aside. I don't know if it's media time he wants. I don't know what. But these congressmen and senators, not only are they like impervious because of their little aides and their staffers, and some of them are okay and some of them are horrid. You know, you can never talk to them, even though they're elected representatives by you, and even if they're their district representatives, you can never talk to them, apparently. But when you send something that's significant to them, and you ask for assistance in that regard, and it's a time-sensitive matter, right? Then that should be acted on. But here's the kicker. If you sit on a committee like the Armed Services Committee or the Foreign Services Committee, you have your duties and your job to make sure that you sponsor and proffer bills that allow for the Congress to vote and then the Senate to vote on the fact that the executive branch has to go and do their job. The mandamus, again, was just telling the Supreme Court that on a routine task of government, that the executive branch has to do their job and recover all human assets, U.S. citizens from Afghanistan, and our sensitive equipment or other equipment. The fact that they claim they destroyed it enough is not even close to being good, you know? And for congressmen and senators to be on these committees, that's their duty. That's their job. Why are you going to have patriots donate money so you can pay some stupid merc firm money to go get one or two guys out? And then brag about on the news when you can go and sponsor a bill to get everybody out at once. I mean, it makes no sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. It's like we're needing to preserve our assets, and in the Ukraine right now, if we're going to send assets, we could use those. Why can't we collect them from over there and transport them down to another usable location? Why wouldn't that be an option?
It would be an option to bolster NATO forces. We couldn't give them U.S. equipment directly. That would be going against what the NATO alliance is dealing with on Putin and his threats, because he did take the threat of the nuclear option pretty quick.
Well, before we get into that, let's back up a minute. What happened to Marjorie Greene? Where did she go in this?
She never responded. She did 4 articles of impeachment. One was about immigrations, and one was about this mandamus I did, and I forget the other two. All of these were put on the back burner because of some other issues that were going on in the country at the time that took priority. So she sponsored them, and apparently there's not been word one about them since. And that makes no sense. I mean, if you sponsor an article of impeachment, your duty is to follow that through. Yeah, you can multitask and do other things, but you shouldn't just turn it off. It makes no sense. So I don't understand that. You know, the goal of doing the mandamus was to try to get someone to put an article of impeachment in. But the actual goal of myself for the mandamus was just to get our people back and tell the Supreme Court, look, this administration has to do a routine task of government. That's exactly from the law on what the president's responsibilities are, and go get our people and our stuff back. That's all I said. I tried to write a biased, nonpartisan mandamus to just state the simple black and white facts of rules, regulations, and the laws that apply to what they did wrong and to fix it. That's just that simple. I'm not trying to get all creative and crazy and wacky and do all this conspiracy garbage. I mean, there's reality and then there's fiction. And I mean, I'm pretty sure that document is a straight reality document.
Yes. Well, hats off to you for taking the time to actually do that because, you know, it came and it went, and then it really went. It went away. It went off the radar and was swept under the rug. And here we are in the next stage. So, has anyone said anything to you at all since then? Has anyone come to you and said, okay, we're going to take this on and go after that? We're really going to go get it.
Nobody will. None of the media outlets will touch it. Nobody wants to touch it. They keep referencing Afghanistan, but no one wants to touch this mandamus. I find that to be shocking. Fox News, One American News, I thought Pearson Sharp, because he's good at stealing people's stuff and taking credit, would have tried that. Nope, nothing.
Amen.
I mean, it's just one thing after another. I mean, so they're all bringing up Afghanistan made us look weak, and they bring up the negatives, but they don't want to go over this mandamus, which is just a practical legal document showing the rules, regulations, and laws that require them to go back and get our people and our stuff. It's just that easy. I mean, I could break it down in lay terms instead of going over all this legal jargon.
Yes, well, you basically did. Now let's move into how that would affect us if we did that. If that actually happened and we got all that back, then what?
Well, for example, if we got back all our citizens and we got back just a couple of items and made sure a few more were destroyed, it would have satisfied a lot of people, but it would have shown strength. It would have shown a great deal of strength throughout the world that we're not just going to let our people languish and our material and equipment be used by our enemies. No one's taken any of these groups, the Taliban, Al Qaeda, ISIS, or Hezbollah, any of those groups off the terrorist list yet. And they can't because they're going to be consummate terrorists. And, we just provided them aid, comfort, and support according to Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution. So this is pretty grievous. So when you're in charge, as a president is, and the SecDef and Sec State, you make a mistake like this, you didn't expect it to go this badly, you correct it. I mean, when you get a private in the Army, I mean, if the guy screws something up that's pretty basic or it turns to, garbage really fast, you make them go back and correct it or fix it. It's pretty simple. And that's what we have to do as a nation. And that's not been done yet.
Well, on that note, let's step into how what we talked about in Benghazi factors into the Ukraine and factors into what's happening right now. And then we'll go into our third segment. But this is really important. And it does kind of tie together in a sense, even in conduct. So let's step into what it is you find as the correlation between today's situation that's come up in the last week and what we discussed about Benghazi.
Well, there's a lot of people that are within government that I call obstructionists. Now, they are for one party or another or one corrupt issue or another, and they're just throwing their oaths in the garbage. And we don't do that. Doesn't matter what agency you work for, you took an oath. And another problem we have is the yes men. They go up and they tell these senior people all the way up to the president, everything's peaches and cream when it's not. We saw Russia's buildup starting in March of 2021 get significant. We started seeing the Russian buildup. We knew we had all this stuff going on, and we were still in Afghanistan at the time. And we didn't take any actions to mitigate that. We did not bolster the Ukrainians with additional lethal aid and all kinds of things. So when it came to August of last year, and we had that debacle getting out of Afghanistan, the Russians and the Chinese saw that as a huge weak link. And it was a simple matter of, well, they don't want to deal with it. And then, of course, we lost our internal fossil fuels, and now we're dependent on, these terrorist states and these horrific countries for, oil and gas. And this is outrageous conduct, and it's an intentional act by not correcting it again. But they passed this new Green Deal thing. And the problem I have with Ukraine is, even before this invasion took place, we knew what was going on. We saw what was going on, and we took no steps. Nothing. I mean, the day of the invasion, they offered President Zelensky asylum. That's basically saying, hey, come out of your country and just let the Russians take it over. That's how I read it. So this administration was telling him, hey, we'll take care of you, get out of there, and we'll try to get you back in. But what you're really saying is, hey, get out of there. We're going to let Russia put somebody in.
Right.
I mean, that's exactly how you have to read this.
And you in your writ, it's William Kotel, petitioner, versus President Jospeh Biden, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. And Anthony Blinken has a lot to say right now. What do you think about what he has to say regarding the Ukraine currently?
It's a show. I can't say anything too derogatory.
You're not in agreement, in other words. The point is, the same tactics that were used regarding Benghazi is kind of being taken in a wimpy kind of way right now. But the tie back to the Ukraine, and potentially even to and with Biden, is curious. So you're speaking fact, and I appreciate that very much. I'm going to lean on a little bit of what other people call conspiracy, and I don't think it's conspiracy, but I am alerted to the fact from incoming sources that perhaps there's more knowledge that went on behind the scenes there than people are letting on. What do you feel about that?
So let me give you my opinion, and I'm going to put this out for your audience. Please don't take my opinion for what it's worth. I really urge you to research what I'm saying so you can see for yourself. If you want to know the truth, there are facts on the table. One of the facts are that President Zelensky is the new president of Ukraine, was prosecuting Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden for the Burisma scandal. Burisma was a major oil company where they took millions and millions of dollars, $1,000 paychecks a month for not doing anything. So there was some kind of tie to the prior president. And Zelensky, when he became the president, he went after them. Several Ukrainians came over to the States to provide proof and evidence to different news outlets like One American News, Fox News, and others, even to provide it to the old Attorney General, William Barr, under President Trump. So there was an axe to grind on a personal level with this president about this current President Zelensky in Ukraine. So it's no wonder we dragged our feet. I'm just going to leave it at that. And you can take it for what it's worth, but you got to look at yourself and look up the history and the data so you see what I'm speaking about, as opposed to my opinionated butthole just running my mouth when I shouldn't. So that's one side of the coin. Now the other side of the coin is the current comments by the former President Trump. Those comments that he's been making about, Putin's a genius, oh, Russia was justified, and all this garbage. Well, you got to look. He was so angry and incensed about losing that election, and there probably was cheating, but because of all the conspiracy theories, no one was going to be able to pull it out. There was just too much garbage going on. But he got mad with President Zelensky because Zelensky didn't prosecute Biden like he wanted. So again, you go back to facts in the media, facts in the news, statements given by individuals. When I mean individuals, I'm talking about President Trump or President Biden or Hunter Biden. You can look at what the Ukrainians provided. So there was an axe to grind from that end. So now you have a former president and a current president that both have an axe to grind with this president of Ukraine. That
And
doesn't bode well for the fact that we were dragging our feet under this current administration. And the bragging rights about, under my watch as president, there was no war. I mean, I don't even know where to go with that. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be negative on both parties, but their actions signify, a little bit of outrage and frustration. I mean, you got to think about this. When an American unit, a military unit, was in Afghanistan or Iraq, if there was an erratic round and there was one piece of collateral damage, there was a massive investigation, and anybody involved with it was held accountable to the highest degree. And if it was a senior guy, sometimes he'd be able to blame some of his juniors. And knuckleheads that want to follow unlawful orders blindly without thinking about their oaths, some of them may deserve it, some of them may not. But at the end of the day, when you contrast our actions in Afghanistan or Iraq for all those years, and you look at one day of Russians in Ukraine, and they've leveled entire cities, all the residential areas are gone. That's not a conspiracy. That's not CGI. That's not anything fake. I mean, every news outlet in the world is on the ground there with some kind of war coverage correspondent, and they're getting bomb shot shells and everything else while they're reporting. So this isn't some kind of game or conspiracy, and there's no neo-Nazis. I mean, Zelensky, he's a Jewish man. His family's Jewish. So you can't sit back and say that. So this whole Ukrainian mess, it was begun by the fact the United States was weak. We dragged our feet. We jumped out of Afghanistan, screwed our own troops over, brought back 124,000 people. We only knew 20,000 of them in the BAT system, and the other 104,000, we don't know who they are. Now they're on U.S. sovereign soil. But we're not even offering Ukrainians, any kind of immigration status or refugee status. I mean, that's a huge contrast.
well, it is a huge contrast, and it seems very calculated, actually. The fact that we're witnessing and watching as opposed to participating. I mean, I was really impressed by how the Polish people took people in, and they were ready immediately for taking that on. And if we had that, we would scream and wail and cry because, we have to extend ourselves. But in fact, we have so much more room in our country, and those cities are going to be overflowing, but they're welcoming them in. Now, let's go back to Benghazi really quickly. You were witness to kind of what went on there, or what got covered up there. And how is that going to come back around now? Why is that important in this play out right now?
Well, it was pretty simple. If you look at the big picture, first off, Central Command was conducting this huge training exercise called Internal Look. We do it every year, okay? That meant that 75% of the workforce was on duty. Then you have your real world personnel working real world issues, and then you have the rest of the command was in, and everyone else was in conducting the training exercise. And at that time, the African command didn't have a formalized command. So my watch floor that I ran had to cover both African commands, basically their intelligence apparatus, as well as Central Command's apparatus. And we were dealing with NATO and BICES and all these other good things. So we were on point with all of this stuff. So we watched this incident from beginning unfold almost to the end. And at no point in time were we allowed to stand down from the training exercise until 8.5 hours after the initial attacks began. It was outrageous conduct. There was an intent behind it. There was elements that were going. They got turned around en route, all this other stuff that went down. So what I'm saying is that the amount of obstruction is in those levels to follow those types of orders that are unlawful and not stand up and do their duty are disgusting. They allowed Ambassador Stevens and 4 other Americans to die for nothing, absolutely nothing. The fact that people came out with conspiracy theories about the ambassador had died of smoke inhalation in the annex before he ever was taken anywhere is another fabrication. There was clear video out there that most of the world saw. The ambassador was at the hospital, and 30 minutes after he arrived at the hospital and was being treated, he died of his injuries. And those injuries were everything from being beaten and brutalized to some smoke inhalation. So it's an outrageous, accusation to have these people come back out and try to do a massive cover up again, just so they can get rid of Benghazi. But Benghazi speaks to the fact that there's so many obstructionists that are within the government and willing to play ball because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. They're afraid that they can't follow their oath because no one listens. Just like I went to the inspector general's offices and they would shut these cases down in a day, not even half a day, some of them. And these are bona fide inspector general complaints, and none of the congressmen or senators are even trying to get involved. And when you ask and solicit their help, they blow you off. Excuse me. So the whole thing comes down to the more people that speak, senators and congressmen and to inspector general's offices, and they try to get their information out, the harder it is for them to walk away and just shut down, say, William Kotel, he's an idiot, or shut down this guy or that guy. That's how they play this kind of game.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Have you sent your mandamus to DeSantis?
No, I did not. I tried calling his office about it. I sent an email with referencing it, and I've received nothing back.
Well,
so
perhaps somebody there, we can get their attention and they can take a look at it, because it would seem to me that he would be in favor of that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, I would assume so. But again, there's a lot of politics these days. There's a lot of Republicans or claimed Republicans, just talking politics for 1 second, that are involved mainly for the money or for the power or position. And they're like, I guess they call them rhinos or something like that. And they're really not on behalf of the Republican Party. And they spin stories and they cause problems. Let me give you an example. There was a moron from the Air Force, a PFC named Nick No, that decided to go to one of these big events at the Dora Resort. And with him was Charles Woods, who came from Oregon. He's a Gold Star father. Ty Woods died in Benghazi. And they went on stage to speak about Benghazi. A gentleman by the name of Ross Perot, a politician. This guy trained falcons for a living. That's what he did, birds. He trained falcon birds for a living for 30 years. He and Nick No put it out that bin Laden was alive.
Right.
It was a complete and total fabrication. But President Trump, in his infinite wisdom, tweeted it, but never corrected it. And I'll explain why. There is still an open bounty on bin Laden. If someone has proof of life on bin Laden and his location, they're entitled to $25 million US. So here's a guy that trains birds that all of a sudden is an intelligence expert. And here's a PFC that worked in Germany for the Air Force for a short time with no real placement or access, putting out bin Laden's alive. And when Trump tweeted it, it restarted a caliphate worldwide because they think he really is. And the actual SEAL team, and especially the Navy SEAL that works with Fox News, came out and was livid about it. But Trump never corrected his tweet. He only made comment like at the end of last year to a news article about, I shouldn't have done that. Well, it's a day late and a dollar short, and these people in these positions have to have good advisors that are willing to tell them no, that are willing to say, so that this kind of garbage doesn't espouse itself and allow for the real issues that people are facing to be put under the carpet. This is outrageous conduct.
Exactly. It's interesting in today's world where he's so open to tweeting and all that someone wouldn't correct that and correct him on it out in the landscape of social media. I mean, surely he probably heard that feedback at some point, but what you're saying is everyone begins to follow the birds that go that way and they're off and running. And now we have a diversion from what is and the truth of what is.
Yeah, they want to use the most sensational, the most off the wall comment or phrase that they possibly can find to not only confuse and befuddle others, but to put people on a different path. It's called misdirection and intentional misleading. And to do that is outrageous. Even myself, when I did the interviews on Benghazi with one group, I did an interview after doing like 4 others. And the one group tried to associate the fact that I said the Iranians were involved with Benghazi when that is completely a lie. And then I come to find out that the person, Mary Fanning, that did this interview decided to write it up that way because she was supporting a guy named Ken Timmerman. Ken Timmerman wrote a book claiming Benghazi was done by the Iranians, which is a complete fabrication. And then the guy is saying that he has proof and evidence, but can't give it because his bestest buddy is in the jail system in Iran and will be killed if he releases those financial documents. It has nothing to do with anything. It's a complete story and a fabrication line that's out of control. But people espouse to this, and they make money off this. The dude's making money off his book. Of course, Fanning supporting him by manipulating what I said. We had this huge argument about removing my story from there. I didn't want my name associated with it or anything. I always tell people, when you do an interview, act like you're going to be subpoenaed to court and have to speak under oath. Because if you don't, it's going to come back and bite you.
That's a really good point. That's a wonderful thing. Now, so what happened with Mary Fanning and Timmerman?
Oh, I don't deal with them anymore. Mary Fanning's the one that came out and got the pillow guy, whatever his name is, to go on and on about the scorecard. Yeah, Mike Lindell, the scorecard, the hammer, and beach ball bombs and all this stuff. A lot of these programs, minus the beach balls, they're old, outdated programs that basically private companies bought. I'll give you an example. Like Google, they bought this thing, the program. What the heck was it? Not the Shadow Net, but I think it was the Hammer. I think it was the Hammer, and it was associated with the Shadow Net. So this program, what it does, so if you go on your phone and you look up, say, Gucci handbags, for example, and you just look it up on regular internet, and all of a sudden, your Facebook gets spammed with a bunch of Gucci products.
Right.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of the programs at work. It finds your patterns of buying, your patterns of spending, and it puts it to use for a private company. And that's what those old, outdated programs were. And a lot of people that were generals and other things supported this. Yes, there was an unlawful election. Yes, there was cheating. But because people like that came out with those stories, and then they couldn't even get the cyber symposium going, and they looked like complete idiots, and that Dominion, who sponsored the voting machines, is suing them, this just puts out really bad vibes. I mean, this is a ridiculous incense. Nobody confirmed or denied the information they were getting. So he just put out stuff that they gave him saying, oh, this must be gospel. And it's not. Nobody bothers to confirm or deny it. Why would you not check on critical information like that could damage or destroy your entire credibility? And if you have a company like he does, destroy it too. Why would you ever jeopardize other people's livelihoods and jobs because you're too, ineffectual to look up this data on your own? It makes no sense. I mean, how careless can people be? Not to at least, look who's giving the information and look it up yourself and see if any of it's true.
That's right. And that even went steps further, didn't it? It's everyone's seemingly coming around the bend to the narrative coming out eventually. And right now, there's even another narrative that you're focusing on. You've done another filing. Let's talk about your next filing. And this one deals with South America and Venezuela. What was your proposal there?
Okay. So I heard on Friday night, my wife actually was Googling stuff and saw an article from the Washington Times. And the article stated that the State Department was sending representatives to go down and talk to Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela. And they said that the source from the State Department leaked it. The date that they were going to go was Saturday the 5th. Well, I flipped out. Yes, this past week. This just happened. Well, I flipped out because if anybody talks to them from the State Department, that legitimizes Maduro's claim to being in charge of Venezuela. And just for the history books, let's talk about this. Maduro was ousted by a guy named Guaido, who was lawfully elected and voted in. And then Maduro maintained power through force. Killed a bunch of the Supreme Court judges, killed a bunch of parliament leaders, and he killed a lot of citizens. I mean, a lot. And he was literally taking the dead bodies from these death squads to different manufacturing facilities and having their bodies disposed of so nobody could find the dead bodies. I hate to put that out, and I apologize if that offends anyone. However, that's what he was doing. And in the interim, since Guaido could never take over, President Trump had him in a State of the Union address and put Guaido on the spot to take back over, Venezuela. That never happened. Since then, Maduro has had good relations with Russia and China and Iran, and they're all sitting there dealing with his oil. He's also dealing with several terrorist groups and cartels, and he's never been lawfully elected to office.
How do you know that?
How do I know that? You can look up the stats. There was never another election about it. It doesn't matter if Guaido wanted to relinquish power to Maduro or not. He wasn't able to. They had to have a special election under the Venezuelan constitution.
But how do you know that he's associated with these groups, and specifically Russia and China?
Oh, I'm sorry. How he's associated with these groups is because there have been informationals that have come out that are unclassified over the last 2 years in regards to those people going to that country, meeting with them at that country, even narcotics and cartels that were busted members that had gone through the routes of Venezuela. And I also want to point out he's still holding 9 U.S. citizens as hostages, and that's never been adjudicated. So there's a litany of reasons why the State Department had no business doing this. But this is kind of odd, so I'll try to describe this the best I can. Last Monday, before this ever came out, I had contacted somebody at the UN through the U.S. Representatives at the UN, and I had stated Maduro has put out 6 media articles and pieces where he's threatening the United States with force. He was threatening us, wanting to come here and attack us with military. But those are his words in his own speeches and written also down in several newspapers and other articles. And I said that gives us the excuse to go down by force, blockade his country with a carrier group, and force him out of office, and allow for the parliament to take the country back over, up and running, special election for the presidency, and allow their oil to go back on the open market because it's the only oil in our hemisphere of the world. Okay? So when I put that in on Monday, on Wednesday, I got a call back from somebody up there. They were spazzing out on me about this entire issue. Why, who are you? Why are you saying to do this and all this? Venezuela is the last thing on our mind. We're worried about what China going into Taiwan and some other garbage. And I'm like, this is important because that puts Russia and China in our hemisphere and collecting oil that we need right now. And he's not a lawfully elected leader. I said, could you please at least just run it up the flagpole and see if somebody higher will listen and we can take that course of action. And then the next thing I know on Friday, because this happened Wednesday afternoon, on Friday, all of a sudden, New York Times is posting that the State Department went to meet, Maduro. And here they are in the news today talking about the meeting they had with Maduro, knowing the Russians and Chinese are down there. This is another sign of tremendous weakness. And this is outrageous. I did Inspector General's complaints on this on Friday night to both Department of State, Department of Defense. And of course, I haven't heard anything back. I've sent it to different congressmen and senators. Nothing comes back. I mean, I don't know at what point, what laws and rules and regulations get violated where anybody gets held accountable or charged at all.
Well, what do you think they're going to do? And what do you think that our position is, having gone down there and had those discussions suddenly out of the blue?
Well, I think Russia's going to set the price of oil and ask Venezuela not to produce. And they're going to use Maduro, who's a murderer and who's also a criminal. And by the way, there's still a $5 million bounty on his head from President Trump, and that's never been removed either. Just saying. So right now, you look at that, and they're going to go ahead and dictate to Venezuela what they can sell and how they can sell it. I mean, and Russia has their own ships down there. I don't need to tell you what that means. I mean, I think it's pretty evident. There's also some ships in Cuba. But we have issued everything in the last year and a half from a position of weakness. Everything from shutting down our own energy independence to Afghanistan to this Ukrainian debacle to now Venezuela. And Venezuela is really run by the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, how much more do you want to give to our enemies? And by the way, Iran's down there as well. So how much more are we going to give to them? How much more can this country withstand?
That's right. And isn't there quite a bit of their gold, which they were rich in, now logged in London banks? I think the London banks have locked in their gold. I think they took a bit of their gold at one point. So that's good times.
Russia took the gold.
They did?
Yes, back in 2018 and 19, Russia flew several aircraft in there and took much of the Venezuelan gold back to Russia. That was all over the news, and nobody stopped them. And that guy Guaido, he didn't really do anything. And Guaido was, quite frankly, somebody that worked with Maduro. He's part of the People's Will Party, which is a communist party. There is a woman that's in the parliament that's a Democrat, or she goes for democracy, I'll say, and she's quite outspoken, Maria Machado. I don't want to get her in trouble by discussing that, but she would have been a viable candidate had we gone down through use of force and gotten Maduro out, because he is legitimately a criminal, not a leader either. But instead, we legitimize his leadership.
Excuse me, wasn't Benjamin Irish? Wasn't he working on trying to? Were the two of you working on that, trying to get her recognized as?
I was. He was trying to help me to get Maduro called out. Basically, through the Trump administration, the bounty that President Trump had put out on Maduro for being a criminal was $5 million US, along with several other key leaders out of Venezuela. Those bounties have never been removed, not this president, not by the State Department or anyone else. So the fact that we're dealing with him is like cutting a deal with a criminal, and at the same time, this criminal has ties and really works for our enemies at this point, both Russia and China. China is not a full-blown enemy, but they are an enemy of ours in a lot of ways. Russia has been making threats, so they are an enemy in a lot of ways. And of course, Iran has always been a state sponsor of terror. So, I mean, I don't know at what point any of the Congress or Senate that we elect to these positions stands up and does anything that they're supposed to do, whether they're on the armed services committees, foreign affairs committees, economic committees, judicial committees, whether they even are effectual in their jobs. I mean, I don't see anything happen in a timely fashion, and they have the ability to do that. But I did see that they did pass this new Green Deal that put us in a conundrum now,
Right.
having to go to not just Venezuela, but Iran for oil. Is this a joke? I mean, what are we supposed to do with that?
Right. And, it seems to me it's a little like the music industry where you have the corporate bigwigs on top declaring what songs should be and what albums should be and what artists should do. And yet they're not the artists. And so you all in the military understand that language and that land and how people operate and act far differently than any congressman or the Senate. They've they may be retired and put into that position, but more often than not, they're not. And so trying to have the same scope and breadth of understanding that you've had up front and personal with it may not motivate them the same way, It's
Well, the whole point of me doing all the things I've been doing is not because I gain anything, I gain nothing. But I do get the satisfaction that some kind of justice was served. You got to remember, there are veterans committing suicide on a daily basis. Active duty military, the same. They don't know what to do or believe. It's very difficult. The military has always been a straightforward, here's your rules and regulations, it's black and white. You just do that and you're fine. Now it's all cut up. This COVID scandal was outrageous. This COVID virus was more outrageous than anything. And a lot of things, if you want to know the truth, like with Putin and Russia and with the United States and others, boils down to money. I mean, the states are all clamoring for their COVID relief money. The president currently has taken back the COVID relief that President Trump passed, and they're doing it through the tax returns, which is horrific. And they're using this money to shut down our pipelines and our natural gas production and our oil production. So we're not energy independent. And they're using it to sponsor, I don't know what, but the Biden administration is screaming for cash. They have no money. That's the whole point. And when a state like New York says, you owe me $15 billion plus, which is about accurate for COVID relief, and that's one state out of 50. I mean, you have to think about the gravity of this. They wanted to make COVID the biggest thing since sliced bread. And they wanted to put a dollar figure on the treatments and then the COVID deaths. And then they made it a money-making game. And now it's in the pharmaceutical companies making hand over fist money, the companies that produce these respirators and these masks and all this. Now, I'm not denigrating COVID. COVID did some real damage to people. Don't get me wrong, but it could have been treated better. And the reason I say that is because in 2013, President Obama stood up on a podium with Dr. Fauci standing right next to him, and 60 million Americans were infected with either the SARS or the MERS virus.
Yeah, and I was one of them.
Obama stated, yeah, he stated straight out, we're going to treat this with hydroxychloroquine. And Fauci said nothing. And barely anybody really knew about this viruses. We didn't know that many people were infected. We had no knowledge of that because he did a good job in suppressing that and to make sure the American economy continues forward. But under President Trump, this COVID virus, it was all about Dr. Fauci, and he said no on hydroxychloroquine, and he said no on other treatments. And they were trying to do distancing and isolation and everything else when these drugs could have helped. And I thought it was really coincidental, which there's no such thing, that there was a hydroxychloroquine manufacturing plant, one in Texas and one in another state.
Right.
Both of them burned down within a week of each other. And the Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu gave us 6 million doses to help offset. And it was never implemented. And again, Trump did a great thing with the Right to Care Act and the Right to Try Act. So people didn't even have the option of trying hydroxychloroquine for some ungodly reason. So COVID was an absolute nightmare, but it should have been a managed nightmare, not the debacle that it turned into, and not this economic fiasco we're in today. So that's
Seems to
where
me
there's a
that
lot of
the left is working very hard at bankrupting the things that are put in motion that could be sustainable, or bankrupting and working on more of a psyop scare tactic rather than an actual solution, or perhaps even a diversion. And that's kind of what it seems like. It's on again, off again. The whole COVID speaks to a bit of a psyops type operation back and forth. Today you have to wear your mask, tomorrow you don't. You have to stand 6 feet over here. You can't go through the door to the restaurant, but once you do, then you're okay and you can sit down. So, it's not coherent and it's not consistent. And I think what you're saying in all these 3 points that you're talking about tonight is that where there was coherency, it got broken, and suddenly there's a complete lack of accountability to the incoherency and the cleanup of it. So what do you suggest we do now in this COVID situation, in, say, every state now asking for that money? What could we possibly do?
well, I'm just going to say what I know is factual. Okay. Another fact is that there was a COVID relief plan put out by President Trump, which allowed for businesses to get loans as long as they kept employing their people. Well, most of those loans were picked up by big business, not by little businesses. And I have a friend that does a cattle business that tried and tried and tried to get the loan because he employs 12 people and could not get it. And another person that I dealt with, he was over there in the process of trying to convert one of his companies into a mass production company to produce masks, which were just standard, hospital gown masks. They weren't N95s or the other high-speed ones. So everybody looked at a means of profiting from this. And because all the states were entitled to this money and all of this, again, when I did the IG complaint to ask the federal government to go down and use New York City as a litmus test to confirm or deny actual COVID cases and actual COVID deaths, they said they would do it, but they never did. And that's because they've already placed a dollar figure on it. So somebody gets hit in a car that's on a bicycle and dies has now died of COVID, because that's $39,000 US for that one death.
That's right.
So if I were this president, I would go out and I would do the litmus test to confirm or deny actual cases. Additionally, there's expendable items like the masks, and then there's durable items which are still accountable, which are the ventilators, the respirators. New York State Governor Cuomo auctioned off all the ventilators he ever had given to him by the federal government. I mean, I don't know how many there were, but they're worth a great deal of money. That equipment still hasn't been accounted for. So that has a dollar figure attached. So there's some cleaning up to do to go back and to confirm or deny these numbers and the actual casualty counts as well as the equipment counts, so that we can get those dollars and adjust what the states are actually owed. And then in addition to that, there's got to be some kind of recompense for the families that lost their lives to this based off of these decisions that were made between the CDC and FEMA and the former, president, and what was being done then, because it was really out of control. And that's not just individuals losing their lives, but individuals that lost their livelihoods, their businesses that went under. They should all have a say in coming back to the table and getting something in compensation for it. It would be really critical. And I think at the end of the day, that if the president were to do something like that, it would put the fear of God into a lot of people. Then you got to look at the pharmaceutical companies and see how much they've made and how much was legitimate, how much wasn't. And then you look at them in the aspects of how much did they really get done and how effective were their treatments or their vaccines. Did they cause second and third order effects? Did they cause blood clots? Did they cause problems? Because one series of bad shots that causes side effects and reactions makes everybody say the shot's bad. I don't want to take it. I personally didn't take the shot. I won't take it, but I'm sure others are just satisfied with taking those shots and they're okay with it. But there's some that just get in there and they get these reactions to it. And that has to be adjudicated by the federal government, not by the pharmaceuticals, so that they can really see where the money should be pulled or pushed from and who's entitled and who's not.
Well, you're asking it to come back down to mathematics and science, really. And what science? And the science being the mathematics in this, like what's the real bottom line? And the bottom line in each one of these scenarios is that, again, accountability to what's taken place, right? So we need that
Right.
accountability. And so
Definitely.
as you sum up all of what we just talked about, which is extensive, your personal experience from your work at Centcom all the way through to what you're doing now. Your mandamus is no little, request. It's a big deal. And those people that have been cited on it are not responding. They can't get the information. Isn't that interesting? They can't get it to where it needs to go so those people can really respond, right? So we're keeping you from responding. It's sort of like censorship in a way. And now you're talking about what took place during COVID and all the loss and all the suffering, and it's swept under the rug again. It's swept under the rug, and I'm not in any way mitigating what's happening and the suffering that's going on right now in the Ukraine. But each one of these examples gets kind of buried, and then the next thing happens. And then the next thing, it's like a moving walkway that you can't catch up to, but something is going to catch up to us. What will catch up to us?
Well, I'll give you an example of news censorship, which is another problem. Right now, everyone's focused on Ukraine, a couple of minor issues in the United States when rule of law still hasn't been established. We still have lawlessness going on in many areas. But the country of Israel has been hit many times by the Palestinians and Hezbollah in the last week, claiming that they're just like the Ukrainians. They're just wanting their own territory, things like this. That's not being spoken about. And currently, the current administration in Israel is less harsh than what Benjamin Netanyahu's administration was. So they're getting around on it. But they just did a meeting in Moscow with, Vladimir Putin. And then they're going to Germany today, I believe, to discuss what Putin talked to the Israelis about. Why should that even be going on? They're like excluding the rest of the world. Like, what's going on here? Why is Israel doing that? I'd love to know that answer. We're not seeing that. We're also not seeing Taiwan is bolstering. China wants Taiwan for one reason. Taiwan is a number one maker of computer chip manufacturers. They do these computer chips and these CPUs and all this computer jargon. I'm probably saying it wrong, but they're the number one producer. China wants them because they want to have that technology that the Taiwanese have. And that's what the whole thing was. If it weren't for Putin threatening nukes and going off the deep end and off the rails, China probably already would have hit Taiwan. But because he got so radical and because his forces literally suck. I mean, his ground forces and Air Force sucks. They're not doing anything they should be doing. I don't know if it's intentional. I don't know if it's the leadership within the military, or if it was just a bad battle plan. But they're doing horrifically big mistakes, And I hate to talk like that, but I'm just saying in general. But he's radicalized and talking about going to the nuclear option like right away. So now China's had to back down. I mean, you look at things like this around the world. So there's a lot of concern about a lot of the rhetoric that's going on, who's allied with who, where the oil's coming from is the number one thing because it's driving the market prices crazy. This kind of garbage. But nobody wants to get a handle on it. So it all goes back to money again. And I think that right now, Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis and the crisis in Ukraine is a major focus. Remember, Putin is now controlling the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. Now, guy doesn't even have to launch a nuke if he wants to make that thing go critical. And remember, in that part of the world, the winds go from east to west. That means anything that comes off of that goes right into Europe. So he could create a nuclear incident without ever launching a nuke. And if he does that, he gets off scot-free, and half of Europe gets cancer and dies in 10 years.
Right. And it's hard to.
And then the oil and the natural gas in that area of Ukraine and other parts of Ukraine would be rendered unusable.
Right. That's a really good point. Yes, it would be rendered unusable, but isn't it convenient that Venezuela might be right in tow? So what's the point of really everyone positioning? Because isn't Brazil a big producer of oil as well? I mean, that's a huge country. Everybody seems to be in there, Monsanto and everyone else.
Well,
what's the difference between, say, Venezuela and their oil reserves in a big country like Brazil? And everyone's already in Brazil. So what's the difference with Maduro specifically being there or not being?
That's a great question. All I can say is that if I were the president right now, I would reverse several of my decisions. I would go down to Venezuela from a position of strength. I would show the Russians I am not playing. I'm going to remove Maduro, who's a criminal, from office. I'm not going to occupy. I'm not going to touch the country other than getting him out. If he refuses to go and his military fights, we'll destroy him in a day or two and get him out. End of story. We put somebody else competent in charge and get their oil on the open market. That's one position of strength. I would also reverse myself on this energy policy. I would start, pumping oil and natural gas more than we are, and getting back on the pipeline. I would try to be able to do that like we were doing under President Trump, where we could export it to Europe and get them off of the Russian energy independence. These are the kinds of decisions that need to be reversed. I would launch an investigation into the COVID monies. Find out who's getting what money and making sure it's lawful.
Okay. Yeah, it seems to me that should we really be focusing on oil at all? It seems like it's the wrong narrative in today's day and age. Maybe there's new technologies that need to be released that, take up some of the brunt of this need for oil anywhere. But oil is still the hot commodity, as is gold. So, a few years ago, China bought up all the gold, or tried to buy up all the gold in the United States. And many times would send us back, and those of us that do metallurgy would send us back gold that wasn't pure. And if you got gold from China, it actually wasn't pure, but they bought up our gold and took it back over there. And so gold and oil, where are we headed with China now, William?
Well, if you just go back to the comments you made, you have to understand right now that 99% of the world, aircraft, boats, cars, cities run on fossil fuels. There's some nuclear power, but again, that's considered to be part of a fossil fuel. There is no human way possible to change it over in one night. There's just no physical way to do it. And you can sit there and scream and yell. People have to go to work. Jobs are a big deal. The economy is a big deal. It's a priority of work for someone to be able to get enough money to put food on the table for their family. And if they can't drive their car because they can't afford the gas prices, or there's no gas, or they have to ride a bike, you tell me how somebody that, say, works in LA and lives 2 hours outside LA gets to LA? You're going to ride a bike, what, for 9 hours to get to work? I mean, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This was done in an expeditious and ridiculous manner. It's time to go back to standards, time to go back to common sense, and to reverse some of these ridiculous policies. If the Democrats want to see themselves in office in the next 30 years, they'd better figure out something to change quickly.
Yeah. Well, aside from like Elon Musk's underground underground roadways, or many cities are switching to like light rails and things, and really LA should have something like that, but it doesn't. But your point is important, because we're still dependent, and that is the point. We're dependent right now, and whatever the war is on it will dictate our economy and our alliances, really. So what's the alliance with uh, the Ukraine for us going forward versus, say, um, like Venezuela? What does the Ukraine offer the US in any way, or what did it offer us before they got attacked? What's the point of that, really?
Well, the Ukraine had its own oil, natural gas, and the big thing is grain and
Great.
wheat. I mean, they were really producing that a lot. That doesn't mean they were producing it and sending it to the United States. I mean, I know there was some import-export agreements made, but I don't know the details of those, so I don't speak on them. But they were a good ally, and they were the farthest eastern country to Russia. They touch Russia, and that's the whole point. And if they offered the European Union their oil as opposed to Russia, that would have been a big thing. Same with the natural gas, and they provide a lot of the grain and wheats to many parts of the world that require it. So the Ukraine is an important country, and the issue between the two or this president and the prior president, regarding this current administration in Ukraine under President Zelensky, they're both touchy against this president in Ukraine. But you can't, just unsee the mass destruction that Russia's causing in the Ukraine. I
Right.
mean, they're leveling cities to the ground. So, the Ukrainians probably should put together what's called an indebtedness package to show what countries owe them what debt, make it a living document, and then they should probably do it all the way up to the point of the invasion. Then from the day of the invasion on, they would need to go over a war reparation package. And I think that's something significant to look at, because if you look at the Russian plan of attack, they thought in 24 hours to 48 they were going to get Kiev and Zelensky. That's what they thought, or that we would remove them and they would take the country. And that didn't happen. So once that stalled, now the Russians are bogged down in a quagmire. I mean, they don't have any means to go in there other than just total annihilation now, and they're showing just how disgusting and evil they really are. And the Russians that are committing these atrocities, I mean, if an artillery unit can't see where they're hitting, they're just being told, shoot this grid zone. They don't know. But the people who are the forward observers or the front lines, the aircraft that are flying, the pilots, they know where they're dropping their bombs. I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
It's astounding. So it's a big mess. But the Ukraine is just an important country to be a sovereign nation on its own. And you asked me about China and what should be done with China. I didn't answer that yet.
Well, go
And
ahead.
my opinion, this is just an opinion on the Chinese situation, is that they have unlawful desires against the United States, and we have the means and technology to defend ourselves, which we're not really taking and using right now, from cyber, from economic attacks, from other types of deviant behavior, we'll say. And we can do those under the table and speak openly in a negotiation aspect to get a dialogue going to make sure Taiwan is declared a sovereign country. That's one thing we should do. And we should also declare that China and the United States, along with other countries, should have open talks about fairness in trading. Just because Russia walks into Ukraine doesn't mean that they're getting away with it. And because we can't provide a no-fly zone because of the nuclear option, and we're not going to go to war with Russia, we're going to support the Ukrainians, but we can't go to war with them. That would just come out bad all the way around, because Putin doesn't care about his people. But for China, I mean, China has a huge population. They have a disputed territory in Siberia with Russia, and right now the entire Russian military that was guarding the borders of China is gone, and they're being used in Ukraine. Um, you know, there's a lot of questions. There's a dispute between China and India. There's been conflict there, and the Chinese are just trying to put out everything they can and grab every island or whatever they want. And the United Nations has become ineffective. So the United States needs to be aggressive on its negotiations, both through the UN and through China and through other countries, and try to come out with something that's longstanding and fair. And we should defend ourselves, economically, cyber wise, and more, like we know how to do, as opposed to holding back because we're afraid of the optics, because that's what they're talking about. And it's crazy. I mean, it's crazy. Just like we should have given lethal aid more to the Ukraine, much more than we did. We didn't do it to try to, mitigate the threat from Putin. Now it's a day late, dollar short. We're giving them the aid, and luckily Zelensky and his country are standing strong. But I mean, they could fall at any moment, and if they decide to bombard the entire country, I mean, all those major cities gone, they would have to be all rebuilt. And you're talking about 40 million populace, and you're talking about 20 million displaced individuals all over Ukraine and other countries now until this thing stops. It's becoming a humanitarian crisis to the 10th degree. So
Yeah.
we're not being aggressive in trying to do anything, and that's my point. We just need to get aggressive in negotiations and dialogue and shut it down.
It's interesting because it seems to me like Russia could maybe give back some of that gold. They're going to need to use it thoughtfully somehow, perhaps for their own economy as well. But let's go back to China for a minute. China is down in Mexico, and there's Chinese troops in Canada. And what does that mean to the United States from your standpoint, from your position?
Uh, to use a phrase that's been used in the past, that's a clear and present danger. Because you have to look at the troops. What type of troops? Are they cyber troops? Are they combat engineers? Are they forward observers? What are they? What is their task purpose where they're at? What does it mean that they're there? Why are they being allowed to house in Mexico and into Canada? We've allowed all these immigrants to keep coming in. We don't secure our borders, and we're right now in a conundrum. And then we took all these extra Afghanis on and didn't even try to stop that Taliban takeover and lose all our equipment and a bunch of hostages. And now we're talking to Maduro. So the intent behind this administration seems pretty clear, that they're intending on making us as weak as we could be. We are now the weakest country on the planet, and we are literally the strongest militarily. We are the weakest on the planet by virtue of policy.
That's interesting. When we were doing our initial interviews, I remember General Vallée was concerned at the time because there was Iranian satellites that were launched with nuclear capacity on them, and they were looking into that at the time. And now, as we are in this position with these Chinese bordering, I also understand that there is a former Communist Party military leader that bought up a lot of land in Texas and has put in a special runway, and he's hiding it underneath the idea of a windmill farm. And so it's right there in Texas. I mean, you can look it up, you can find it, it's there. And
Well, Lloyd Goodenow from a company called Executac, he's a former Marine and does security and threat analysis, had brought up to the New York governor's office, New York State Police, and to one of the sheriff's office up there, that the Chinese had bought this large piece of land, and they built some kind of factory that they put on their own private security. But the private security that they put around it is so high level. It's like, I mean, it's almost like, you're going down to Beijing to one of their senior buildings with all their classified stuff. And yet nobody has gone to investigate that or look at why that's even there. What's the task
where that
purpose of
is?
it?
Where is that? In New York State?
Upstate New York. Yes.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Huh. Well, there seems to be a lot of land acquisition deals for cash. And when I was talking to Colonel Peck about some people that he spoke to, there's a woman that is a Chinese national that's boasting on YouTube about buying up land and and houses all over. And so what you just said is something that people should be aware of and know about. How can that go in, and how can those things happen with that kind of security without, say, an announcement of what that is or what's going on? Wouldn't the township or the city be part of that? Don't they have to be?
Well, the sheriff's office refuses to go in there. And nobody from the federal government has acted, according to Mr. Goodnow. And there's been a great deal of concern by some of the local residents on that. Even the sheriff was concerned about it because he wasn't allowed to go in. He was making comments as well. And it's interesting as this current federal government, since the end of the President Obama era till now, many of the agencies that are tasked with internal protection and security, like Homeland Security, FBI, Marshals, and DEA, and then the external security of the country, which is the CIA and others, they're not as involved and they're not reachable. You can't tell anybody, that say something or see something, say something routine doesn't work. And even law enforcement, like Tampa Police down here, they have a hard time reaching even the FBI duty agent. And then the guy doesn't want to come out. And they talk about that they're doing their job. They're not doing their job. Their job is to go out and to find these threats. The anti-terrorist groups that are constituted within most of the federal agencies are not doing their job. They are not. And this is a very scary thing. I mean, if I were the president, I would be doing a series of executive orders to get rid of these obstructionists and execute on United States security first, and deal with our problems, our issues with economics, with oil and everything else. These are the kinds of things that should be the priorities of work to the president. But instead, the priorities of work are catering to Maduro, a murderer and a criminal who's tied to Russia, China, Iran, and terrorist groups and cartels, and to ask and beg and plead for oil, recognizing him as the actual leader of Venezuela. This is going to turn the Venezuelan people against the United States in the biggest way possible, because now we've legitimized this guy's criminal behavior.
Right.
This is outrageous conduct. We terminated a nuclear missile test with the Minuteman III, so we didn't provoke Russia. Is that real? I mean, that was a scheduled test for over 2 years. Again, a sign of weakness. And it just continues. I mean, the patterns of misconduct continue on. In Afghanistan, the energy independence, you can just put a list up there. I mean, not one thing I'm saying is false. You can look at everything I've said up. It's coming from like news sources and many other places that you can look up online. Joe Bag of Donuts blog even covers this stuff now. People that have no common sense or education can sit there and espouse all of this stuff because it's so readily available. So where does it stop? And then the internal strife in the United States with the loss of the rule of law. Now criminals run the day, and prosecutors don't prosecute criminals, even if they're murderers. I mean, when did we ever see this or hear this before? So you got to go back to basics at some point. I mean, somebody's got to be able to take the reins and do their job.
Well, the problem, I think, is that an example for this area that you were talking about in the upstate New York region is, there was, it came to me, in front of me, before you and I did our first interview, that there was an AI lawsuit that was filed in California, and it named many of the Chinese government, Biden, Obama, the Clintons. It talked about all the AI technology that's been developed and is now out of control, literally including like dragonflies and mosquitoes and bees and things like that they've altered and that they've programmed, and organ harvesting and all these other things. And it's legitimate. I mean, it's just an extensive lawsuit that they filed and they put out there. They also cited, which I thought was very interesting, the fella that bought a tremendous amount of land in the Adirondack region near the Lake Placid area that was previously the Rockefeller estate. Yes, I believe it was the Rockefeller estate. And he put in his own 747 runway as well in the middle of the woods. Now that's curious. And he was cited in that lawsuit. But when I went up there to do interviews with the Olympic athletes, they said, "Oh, have you heard of the Jeff Bezos of China? He just bought all this land and put in his own runway right there. And he bought, this estate that belonged to the Rockefellers." Well, that area is not too far from New York City, if you want to look at it that way. It's kind of a hop and a skip, right? But the fact that
Yep.
these lands are being purchased and then private runways are being put in and things like that, that's convenient, especially in the woods. It's convenient. But why is Fort Drum or other places not? mm, Maybe they do know about it, but Fort Drum was one of those places where they took a lot of those people that were coming in over the border and were moving them around, strangely, out of Fort Drum, according to Monkey Works. And so we've got a lot of interesting things that are happening within while we look over without on the outside. And all of it matters. But like you said, this is a really big deal in terms of security and removing, as you say, obstructionists. How do you determine who's the obstructionist? I mean, everything's like this moving walkway at the moment. It's a shell game.
So let me give you an example. So President Trump issued an order when he first came into office, and he stated, we're going to remove the illegal immigrants that have committed crimes. Okay.
Right.
So by the time the order gets from President Trump all the way down through Texas, somewhere in Texas, an ICE agent decided that I'm going to get Sergeant, I forget the guy's name, Rodriguez or Ortega or somebody like that. Let me get Sergeant Ortega, a U.S. Army sergeant, 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? And his family, and let me deport them. Now, the intent behind whatever jackwad gave that order, he totally, manipulated President Trump's initial order, and then that family got removed from the United States. And here's a sitting sergeant in the United States Army that's stuck in Mexico because he's not a U.S. citizen. So that's an example of an obstructionist. Now, that would be a supervisor's level. So if you're an ICE team down in Texas, your supervisor is like somebody, who's in charge, a lieutenant or a captain or whatever in the ICE realm, and they issue that order. That's the order you as an ICE agent will follow because that's your boss told you what to do. But that wasn't the order that President Trump had put out. So that's an example of an obstructionist. That's the simple way to put it. I mean, you can look the cases up yourself, and you can see where somebody issued a decree, an order, an executive authority, command, or whatever, and then from that person, when it went down to the level that executes or does the duty, that it was changed somewhere in midstream to where it would, one, embarrass the administration, and two, put pain or hurt on just normal people.
Right.
Because at no point were any of those people criminals. At no point did they ever do anything wrong. And that sergeant was a decorated NCO in the United States Army for his combat tours and service, and was still in the U.S. Army when they deported him. So this is a clear example of how obstructionists screw around with the government and its orders. And for a planet of 8.2 billion people, it's interesting how only a few are known, but they're always repeated being known for something. And it's interesting how these obstructionists are not some of those people. That sergeant and his family were known. They're all over the news. President Trump was known. He's all over the news. But that supervisor was not. Whoever changed that directive, that order, and did that, that's an obstructionist. And that's a felony offense under federal law.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's important to do that. Then when I go back to Benghazi and I spoke about that, I said, we can call on the carpet those that were in charge and find out who issued the order to turn rescuing troops back. Who turned the Marine Corps expeditionary unit that was on one of the ships right off the coast back? Who turned back the special ops guys in flight? Who turned them back? What happened to Blue Mountain Security that was on the outer perimeter? Why weren't they in there helping that initial security team, which is a subcontracted team, and protecting it? What happened? Who issued those orders? Why did it take so long for anyone to get there? Why were all the security requirements for that annex? They requested more personnel, more machine guns, and more cameras because They couldn't adequately pull security. Why was that all denied? And why did they pull out some of those security assets before the hit happened? We can go back and find who that is through executive order easily. But that's not been done.
Yeah.
So we could find out who that obstructionist was, and then we could find that chain. These are the kinds of things that have to happen, because let's be realistic. That caused people's lives to be taken. People died. United States assets and property were burned and destroyed. Why? Who issued those orders? Who directed people to do that? That's the obstructionist we want to find.
That's a really good point, William. That's a really good point. And those people didn't just die. Some of them were tortured and died to make
Ambassador Stevens was tortured and brutalized and died of his wounds in the hospital.
unnecessarily. Yeah, for someone else's gain.
Correct.
Isn't it interesting, in upstate New York is where Hunter Biden's diner still sits, in a really small town called Auburn. And there's a plaque in the neighboring Finger Lake to Bill and Hillary Clinton. And that goes back to some of what we've talked to on the Benghazi interviews. So it's interesting that it's sitting in that state, and that state seems to be having so much going on with it as well right now, like what you mentioned.
Well, I did send you the video/audio of my interview about my mandamus with Sean and Donna,
Yes.
and hopefully you heard it and you could have listened to it, and maybe you can play it out a little bit for some of your audience at some point. Not now I'm talking, but they can maybe link to it. That might help as well to understand a little bit more context. Because a lot of people are afraid these days that they're going to get sanctioned by the government, or credibility destroyed, or even some of them fear they're going to die by the government. And that's not how we should be living. That's not the United States. That's not what our country's about. So
No,
it's just incumbent on people in power to do their job. Just simply do your job.
well, we need the opportunity to have free speech and have what you file be actually filed in, right? So your mandamus
Yeah.
should be recognized and filed in. And again, if people want to read that, they can go to makinglifebrighter.com, and it'll be on the website, so you can look at it there. Sergeant William Kotel, I can't say thank you enough. This has been really informative and a delightful talk. And I look forward to hearing the updates of what happens. And hopefully someone's going to take this up and work it forward, especially, I guess we're going to see how it unfolds with Venezuela as well, thanks to you and what you did. So, other people.
I did send you an email with that. Well, I sent you the email with the IG complaint, exactly how I worded it. You can also post that on the website if you want, so you can see how I worded it.
All
It's
right.
just short, pithy, and to the point, but it cites exactly what I recommended, and then it cites the action they took, and I stated exactly why you can't take that action.
Beautiful. Well, we can do that, and we can also throw up the audio of what you talked about, and with your permission, that's great. So thank you very much. And do you have any closing comments of how you'd like to see the world?
Yeah, I'm just going to put this out. I like to make sure everybody understands my perspective. This is all negative, what we're talking about, but that doesn't mean everything is negative in the world. And it just requires people to stand up, do your own IG complaints, talk to your own congressmen and senators, your local and state politicians, go to your school groups, your church groups, to wherever you congregate at or have friends with. Have them start doing the same. There's power in numbers, and that's the key to doing things, to getting things changed. Even with the school board problems everyone's been facing recently, to the economy right now. But it can be changed. It can turn around. It can do it kind of quickly. And I think we have an obligation as just regular law-abiding citizens to put these people accountable for their actions. Look, we voted you to office so you do your job. You're not. And we're going to say you're not, and we're going to make it really loud. And if we can take legal action on you, we will. If we can get you criminally charged, we will. And put the fear of God into them. Because once they get elected, it's like they're in this closed door room where no one can speak to them or see them again, and they don't do anything that they stated they would do. But we can change that as people, as good Americans. We can change it all. We have the ability to do it. So don't be disheartened by everything. Just look at it like it's lessons learned, and let's move forward and just kick ass and take names.
And do it. And that's the difference. You're saying just, stand up and actually do something, because what's happening is people are watching the show and they're emotionally sympathizing, but you're doing it. You're out there actually filing these things and following up and doing your homework and filing. So I just want to say thank you very much for all that you've done and for all you continue to do. And I will look forward to our next installment of your hard work. So thank you for being on Making Life Brighter again. And we'll have you back very soon.
Thank you all. God bless.
Yes. All right, everybody, have a go jolly evening. And I hope that was informative for you. Please share and like and let the world know exactly what it is that William Kotel is doing out there. Retired Army Sergeant William Kotel, right here on Making Life Brighter. Thank you so much for listening. And again, you can go back to Voice America online and you can look up the shows that we did in 2019 on Benghazi if you'd like more closure. Thank you for listening, and we'll have you back here with us really soon. We have some interesting upcoming shows about the court system and common law. Thank you so much.